My name is Totlin Oliver, and I am your host for another exciting episode of Why I Write. And if you have been following my page here on Facebook, you know that our very special guest today is a longtime journalist, a longtime colleague of my own, none other than Earl. I don't know his middle name, Moxam. Welcome, Earl. How are you today?
Very well, Tatlin. And let me just pick up on that particular point. When I was a little boy, I hated my middle name. And now that I am not so small anymore, I do love my middle name. It's Aaron. And it was also my father's middle name. And he was Carl. So the only difference between my full name and his was the letter E versus the letter C. Carl Aaron Moxam, Earl Aaron Moxam.
I like that. That's a nice place to start the story because your name sounds as if it should be more than just Earl Moxam. It sounds like it should be Earl Aaron Moxam. Why you didn't like your name when you was a little boy?
Well, when you are a youngster, and there was actually an elderly gentleman in the community who was sort of looked down on, and the other children would tease him. And when they learned that my middle name was Aaron, then I also became the object of their fun. Yeah, so, children can be quite cruel. And so that was the reason, plain and simple, being a picnic, not understanding. As you mature, you understand that I'm proud of the heritage.
Listen, I tell you, and the heritage is what contributes to who you are today and what contributes to you penning your first work as an author. Vantage point from a journalist. Eyesight.
Yes, yes.
So in working through coming to the point where we have a solid book in our hands, and that looks like a big, thick, beautiful book. How many pages are in that book, Earl?
It's almost 300 pages. I forget sometimes exactly how many, but in terms of the actual text, it is 275. So it will keep you occupied for a little while.
And in discussion with you leading up to tonight's conversation, I like the special ways in which you have written this book. But we're going to save that discussion for a little bit later on down in our conversation. And let us start with your heritage. You're originally from St. Elizabeth, one of the most beautiful parishes I have ever seen. Wow. What was life like growing up as a youngster in St. Elizabeth?
I suppose it is cliche to say that my growing up years that were idyllic, but the innocence of youth, the simple pleasures that I took growing up in Treasure Beach, I will always treasure. Just think about it. On a Friday afternoon, post lunch at primary school, you will recall, or you should know, that for most country schools in those days, school was really half day. And in fact, not many children attended school on Friday. So those of us who were really dedicated, we went for half the day, and then it was time for fun thereafter. And the school was just a few chains up from Calabash Bay, which is where my father and his father and grandfather, several generations of Moxams, did their fishing. So that is where I would then go for market day. And market day, or should we say market day, at Calabash Bay was a melting pot. That is when the people from up in the mountain, as we used to say, that is from up Potsdam, Monroe area, and Malvern and Southfield, that's when they would come down with their produce to sell to the fishermen and the ladies down there. And they in turn would purchase the fish on the beach. And fish used to be in abundance on those occasions, during those days. And so you had that cross-cultural mix, which would never be taken for granted. Fast friendships were formed right there on the beach, and there were all the goodies for the children. And on Fridays, a butcher would come as well. And so you had quite an array of things goods being exchanged, and fun for the children on the beach. And that sort of interaction stayed with me. It has sort of helped to drive my own imagination in terms of recreating that aspect of my childhood. And then there was the playing of the games, particularly cricket in the pastures. You know, right now, people who have come to know Treasure Beach, they know of the sports park, where we have hosted some international stars right there. Most recently, the great Brian Lara and Chris Gale playing in a charity match at that park. When I was growing up, that was a genuine pasture in which we would compete with the cows in the pasture. We would you know, set up the wickets and shoo the cows to one side, and we would then go at it. And that was a sort of idyllic, and I come back to that word again. Just think about, you know, playing cricket in the pastures, just having fun.
It's just freedom.
Just freedom.
Just freedom.
Yes.
And that's normal, just normal freedom, you know? Wow. Wow. As I listen to you describe your experiences in idyllic Treasure Beach, I only discovered Treasure Beach for myself directly about 25 or so years ago when I went down to the Treasure Beach Hotel. And I've never seen anywhere like that anywhere else in Jamaica. And it was so pristine that now, as you say, people have now come to realize that, boy, you know, this is a wonderful place. At any time when you're busy running up and down on the Treasure Beach area near Calabash Bay, did it ever occur to you that this is where your life would be today? What were you thinking of becoming when you were a little boy, running up and down and just having a good time?
I always saw myself in one of two fields, one or the other, either as a journalist or as a lawyer. Well, I have been a journalist for 31 years now.
Indeed, congratulations.
Thank you.
Time.
And I have also studied law. So one helps the other.
Oh, yeah.
One helps the other. But let me just quickly take you back to 1992 when I entered Radio Jamaica, and the fact that when I mentioned that I was from Treasure Beach, nobody laughed at it more uproariously than Michael Sharp, because he had never heard the name before, and he just kept laughing at Treasure Beach. Yeah, what kind of place that? But to give him credit, when he saw my passion, he took it seriously. And when I told him of the stories of the fishermen and their challenges, and that I really wanted one of my areas of focus as a journalist to be the one that looks at these challenges, the matter of safety and security at sea, and how by reporting on these issues, I might be able to bring some transformation to their lives. And he took me up on that. And within months of arriving at RJR, he helped to arrange a trip with the JDF Coast Guard to go to the Pedro Keys. And so he went along with me and Christopher Castriota, and we reported comprehensively on those issues. And I would hazard a guess that we might have been the first journalists ever to set foot on the Pedro Keys.
Wow. That is a phenomenal story. But before we even come into 1992, I want to walk with you in memory from the time you were playing on the beach to the time you went through secondary high school, through, you know, how you made your way to Kingston, and what were some of the milestones that you passed through to come to the point where, yes, you studied law, you went to university, wherever, and you studied the various disciplines that just dovetailed you into repeating those stories that you heard, because you have a background also in library science.
Yes, let me before I depart Treasure Beach, and I'd mentioned the vendors coming down from the hills. Well, growing up on the plains, the only light we would see in the late 60s, early 70s, and well, way through the 70s into the early 80s, really the only lights we could see on the hill were the lights at Monroe College. And symbolically, that was a huge inducement for me to somehow make my way to Monroe. What I did not know at the time, because my parents didn't tell me, was that one of my great-grandfathers, Joseph Keith James, was among that first generation of students to attend Monroe, because Monroe was established in 1856, and he was born in 1859. And so by the early 1870s, he was a student there. And he became an elementary school teacher. And later on, he became the postmaster for the community. And so all of the births registered during that period in the community, they have his signature on them, which is a pretty cool thing, just to look back and see your great-grandfather's signature on these records, these birth records, and some other records as well. But, you know, as I've written in the book as well, the journey away from the cane piece, as I put it, is not a linear one. You know, there are many zigs and zags along that journey. And so across a generation, my family, like many others, have had, you know, their good fortune and their misfortune. And all of those stories, as I grew up and I absorbed them, helped to shape my character and my outlook on life. And so those stories and those experiences inspired me to, I became a storyteller just by listening, in a sense, to my parents, sitting, looking up at the stars at night and just listening to their stories, because at the time we did not have electricity in my section of Treasure Beach. So we had no television. We did have the radio, and we would listen to Dulcimina every evening, like so many other Jamaicans. And listen, by the way, to Ralston Mackenzie's comments at the end of each episode, which was as much a highlight as the stories themselves. But that sort of early grounding in the narratives and telling those stories from my mother and father, and they were very good at telling stories. I think that they helped me in terms of shaping who I was to become. And fortunately, I did very well in terms of English language and literature and history at school. And so it was fortuitous that I ended up, first of all, as a library assistant at the St. Elizabeth Parish Library. After I left Monroe, I did 1 year there. I got a scholarship from UNESCO through the Jamaica Library Service to study librarianship, and did that for a few years. What I did not fully appreciate at the time is the extent to which that discipline would have then filtered into my approach to journalism, because the discipline of librarianship in terms of record management, in terms of collecting, storage, retrieval, all of that allowed me to take a different approach perhaps from many of my colleagues who would see each assignment as something that stands alone. And once you have written your story, you know, you discard the rest of the material. Not me. I preserved everything. Gotcha. And so I still have with me reports I did from 1992 when I started.
That's splendid.
Yeah, so that has gone into help. That has really, really been very helpful in terms of my capacity for recall and reproducing things from decades ago.
I love that. That is something that you are to be highly congratulated for, because I know that some of the quarrels we have in Jamaica amongst ourselves as Jamaicans, we whine and we complain a lot that we don't seem to be preserving our history. We don't seem to be preserving the richness of what we have lived through, how we have lived. and some of the highlights of just life as it unfolds, because we're living in the midst of history every time we unfold. So to be able to go back to earlier reports that you have done and literally trace a line and connect the dots, I think is very important. I believe that when we come into the business of communications, coming to communications with a multidisciplinary approach,
Yes.
is one of the best things ever, because in our role as the conduit between the listener and treating with a subject, we are able to look at things in a more prismatic way than just linear. This is the story. Let's give it to you. Chew it up. Okay, that's it. Okay, the man has bitten the dog. Okay, tomorrow another man will bite another dog.
Yes.
Kind of thing. So that is absolutely remarkable. What would you say, Earl, is the most intriguing, outstanding element of life in St. Elizabeth, in the country, as opposed to living now in the city where people operated totally different from people in the rural areas?
Well, first of all, the most basic is that as a country boy, when I got into Kingston, it was certainly a culture shock. When I'm passing somebody on the street and I say good morning and the person doesn't answer. Just basic manners, basic manners, and just looking out for each other. I must say that in time, and depending on the particular section of a community in Kingston that I lived, yes, I did develop good relationships with my neighbors, and I became part of a citizens association in Mona Heights, for example.
Right.
But it was never quite the same as when you're growing up in the country. And I can tell you that to this day, the greatest pleasure for me is when there's a section of my hometown which we call Moxam Hill, which is where my great-grandfather, Richard Sonny Moxam, established his homestead, and where all of his children and grandchildren mostly inherited land. So to this day, that's Moxam Central for us, where I go up there now. I go down there and I go on that hill and I sit with my cousins, incidentally, overlooking the same sports park I mentioned earlier. And we just sit there and we can just chat. And that is when the quote unquote proper speaking Moxam, you will hear me let loose in terms of patois, because that is where I suppose that's where you speak your heart language.
Of course.
With those you know best and those who know you best. And I don't have to, at that point, I'm not expounding on anything profound.
Right.
We're just having fun.
Yeah, you just talk. You just talk.
Yes. Yes.
You know? It is interesting that I know growing up in our era, in our lifetime, that we were required to know and speak English very well. Of course, the native tongue was not lost on us, and there's some things that you just can't explain in English.
Exactly.
Oh, you're good.
Yes.
It has to be said and done in Jamaican.
Yes.
You made your transition now from doing your library studies. Where did that take you in terms of leading you into journalism? Because that's quite a bit of a switch.
I don't think this switch is as dramatic as you might, at first glance. Right. It is one that one facilitates the other in terms of the fact that I took with me, as I said earlier, that sort of discipline that caused me to immediately, in a sense, find a niche in journalism, in that I quickly became the one who did some of the deeply researched based stories and features. the one who would go off to the National Library of Jamaica to dig into the old newspapers or some other document. I was the one who, for example, volunteered, in a sense, to do the research to write Michael Manley's obituary, which was quite a challenge.
Why was it a challenge, though?
Because he was a complex human being. And so when you are going to be doing the obit for someone as monumental as that in terms of his space in Jamaica's history, you had better make sure you get it right, or as right as possible.
Right.
So that's just a sense in which I'm speaking of the challenge.
Okay. I was fearing for a moment there that the documentation wasn't as voluminous as it ought to have been.
Right. My recollection is that the information was good enough, but also I'd had the opportunity to interview him twice before his passing. So between my coming into journalism in 92 and his death in early 97, I had done 2 quite substantial interviews with him. I'd also, during that period, interviewed former Prime Minister Edward Seaga. I also interviewed Prime Minister then P.J. Patterson. I'd interviewed quite a few in those first few years in journalism. I'd interviewed several prominent leaders from the political movement and those adjacent to the political movement. So that helped to build out my resume very early, and it made me pretty confident about that kind of work. And within a short time as well, I started covering Parliament, thanks to Michael Sharp, who helped with my transition. You may recall that for quite some time had been his beat, and he facilitated my transition into becoming parliamentary reporter. Right. And the learning curve for that was quite steep.
I tell you something, I lift my hat off to people like you and Michael Sharp. You have covered when I worked with the Jamaica Information Service in my entire life, everything was over my head. I know it was important, but I was not your reporter girl. I was not the girl to go there and lift segments to create a magazine program for the government's information service. No, sir. So when I hear and see people like you and Michael just chopping it up and making it palatable, I tip my hat off to you.
I really enjoyed it.
It's not easy. Yes. And that came across too. As you build, I'm asking for me an obvious question because I've been there, done that. As you're building your craft as a journalist, where you have to carry through believability, you have to take responsibility for the dissemination of the information. Again, as I mentioned before, you have to connect the dots and you have to make sure that you get it right. How did this even further and shaped your character as a man, as an individual doing this very important work? And I ask you this question, why? I'm going to tell you why I asked the question. Because so often, Earl, when it comes on to things of this nature, it's not as highly regarded, say for instance, as a lawyer or a doctor. But I find that the work we do is very, very critical to our communities, not just a small nucleus, but to the world at large because of what we do. How did that shape you?
Well, I quickly came to understand the extent to which the listener and later the viewer or the reader, the extent to which they reposed such confidence in us. They expected that what we told them would be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so that for me was and remains a very, very serious responsibility. And so getting it right has always been very critical to me. And I'll give you an example. I suppose, well, I was told on several occasions that I was being too hard on myself. But one night, this was somewhere around 1996, 1997, I had worked through the day. I'd gone to Parliament at about 9 a.m. I covered a committee of Parliament, which ran from 10 a.m. to just after midday, took a break, covered the sitting of the House of Representatives, then and did reports on those stories on those two sessions. Then I went to Broadcast House, where at the time we had just recently started Beyond the Headlines, which used to run at that time in the early days from 10:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. And I was a producer and sometimes presenter on Beyond the Headlines. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I would write stories from Beyond the Headlines. And I'd also write more stories from Parliament, plus the 5-minute feature Inside Gordon House. Mm-hmm. And so you can well imagine how tired I was. I was exhausted. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, writing a story coming out of that night's edition of Beyond the Headlines, I was writing a banana story. And I think the Prime Minister, it was a regional story, and the Prime Minister who had spoken to was the newly installed Prime Minister Edison James of Dominica. And instead of writing Edison James, I wrote the name of another recently installed Prime Minister, Denzel Douglas from St. Kitts and Nevis. Mm-hmm. Now, at 6 a.m. when I heard, and luckily it was 6 a.m. when I heard the name Denzel Douglas in terms of Edison James, mm-hmm. I was so upset. I called my then editor, Jennifer Grant, and said, Jennifer, if you want my resignation, you can have it. Jennifer, she said, Earl, just go back to sleep.
You guys run a real tight newsroom.
It was crazy. It was crazy. But I say that to make the point that I took that kind of, perhaps I was too intense, because you could have a mental breakdown if you thought that you could not ever make a mistake. Mm-hmm. But so I think I've learned over time to be a little bit more forgiving of myself, while at the same time not taking for granted the fact that I need to get it right, but understanding that sometimes you may fall short of the highest standards, but it's important to just continue to strive to do your best.
Yes, I believe that you all did that. I have the greatest amount of respect for the newsroom in that era, all the way through to 97, all the way down into the 2000s when I was there, because I spent 2 different stints there.
Yes.
With Power 106. And I know, being a news reader, that the work that you all put in is no easy feat. Sometimes when you have breaking news and you're coming into the studio and you need to read it, stop playing that music.
Yes.
Because it's breaking news, it's important news, it's important story. And there's never a dull moment in the newsroom. There's always a story. What has been your favorite story that comes to the front of your mind? There may be several. What's the favorite story that comes to mind that you have covered in your career? What's the thing that when you think about it, you say, wow.
Yeah. You sort of caught me off guard there. But we had mentioned Michael Manley earlier and doing his obituary. The thing about, and in fact, I've written a chapter in the book focused on his death and burial. Mm-hmm. And what stands out for me about that is the fact that we broke the news that night when it happened on Beyond the Headlines, which, as I said earlier, had started out as a nighttime show. And I go through how meticulous the preparation was and the importance of getting it right. The worst thing you can do is to announce somebody's death before the person has actually died. And that has happened from time to time in broadcasting. And so it was very meticulous in terms of our preparations, and having somebody of the highest integrity close to the scene to confirm for us when it had happened.
Wow.
And so again, you take no pleasure in this, but it's important to get it right. And so I was the producer. I was the person who had made all the arrangements for coverage. I was the one who had done the obits, etc. And so to me fell the responsibility to make the call when that person called me in the dead of the night to then signal to, first of all, signal to Juna McGlashan to punch off the breaking news theme, and to signal to Judith McLaughlin, who was on the microphone. Dion Jackson Miller was then broadcasting from out of the Western Bureau in Montego Bay. Judith was in studio with me at Lyndhurst Road. And so we went with it. And thereafter, for the rest of the night, it was all action. But an interesting element of our coverage that night as well, which I've written about, is that it fell to me to wake up Edward Seaga and tell him that his greatest political rival, Michael Manley, had died. Now, you don't wake up Edward Seaga in the dead of night unless you have a good reason to be calling him. And suffice it to say that his response was very human, very empathetic. It was a kind of response that some people might not have expected of one or the other concerning the other. But then we also fail to understand that these people know each other at a level different from what we see on the political postings or across the aisle in Parliament. They're very human too, and they know that, so they appreciate things about each other that we do not immediately discern or understand. And for me, that was one of those experiences that have stayed with me. I saw that moment humanized Edward Seaga for me more than perhaps any other encounter I've had with him.
Absolutely splendid. I love that anecdote. I love that anecdote. It reminds me of one encounter too that I had with him. I had the reason to introduce him at the Michael University College, where he was giving a lecture in the lecture series. And I had written the introduction from what his office had sent over as his bio. When I was finished with it and I introduced him, read it, he came up to the lectern and said, you know, that is the best introduction I've ever heard of myself, ever.
Well, you know, he didn't give out compliments very easily.
Exactly. And I've been knowing this man from I was working at JIS from the 1980s. So when I heard him say so, I'm like, thank you. Thank you to all of you, because you all set a standard for us to live up to. So I understand all of that. We've been talking with Earl Moxam, a journalist and now author. And I just want to big up some people who took the time to tune in to us. Franklin Grant Sr., thank you for watching. Wanlis Campbell, Andreen Bonner, thank you so much for being here. Cyrus Rousseau, Dave Rodney from out of New York, who is keeping up his own news stories too online. I see all the time. He says, big up to JS and the waves of talent that pass through. And he says, wow, I'm so loving this. Excellent interview with the realization that one is only human. Bruce Wallace is also watching. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. So here we are. The reason I'm so happy, Earl, that we're having this conversation now, because so many of our colleagues have gone on before us. As we were talking before coming on air, we're talking about the likes of Doreen Samuel's gone already, you know, Francois Sanjous. We're speaking of Michael Sharp, and so many others, Martin Henry, so many, because we're a small community. It doesn't matter which station house you work at. The fact of the matter is that we all know each other, and we also know each other. And even like, for instance, when in my jobs, different roles as PR person or, whatever, I relied so heavily on your community, on our community, to support whatever it is that we're doing, and we're able to share that news coming in. So with this wealth, this 31-year wealth of journalism, you have sought to capture some of what, or a lot of what, we have been just touching on from the start of our conversation. Earl, what made you decide that, you know what, I need to do my book? I need to get together these ideas, these thoughts. I need to do a book. What brought you to that writing table?
I think I always had the ambition to write more substantially than my daily job required me to do. And because I have always been a bit of a pack rat in terms of preserving so much material, I knew that I had the wherewithal to do so. I felt that in terms of my journalism, that I'm just looking around amongst all of us in media in Jamaica, I felt that we, to a certain extent, for very understandable reasons, had perhaps not been doing just sufficient justice to ourselves in terms of making that further step to write books, which is done so easily in markets like in the United States, because the resources are so readily available to our colleagues and counterparts in these developed countries. So when I say that not doing justice to ourselves, this is not a criticism.
No, it's not.
Of my colleagues, because I understand the constraints. And in fact, I understand it even more so now, having gone through the experience. Mm-hmm. But I nevertheless, I felt that some of us, if we can, should make the effort. And so I decided that, given the fact that I had collected all of this information, I had recorded all of these interviews, I had preserved all of this material, plus I actually do love writing. I like being very expressive. I like the narrative style that perhaps I have developed. I am a keen fan of the writing style of Charles Dickens. And therefore, I think my writing style was influenced by his writings. I think to a certain extent, it was also inspired by Vic Reed. And I'm thinking now of The Young Warriors, for example, which was one of the early books I read in primary school. That sort of fast-paced, adventure-style narrative, which I think comes out in terms of how I've written this book. Each chapter is grounded in a particular story, is grounded in a particular encounter, which then sets the context in which I share the rest of the relevant material in that particular chapter.
Yes. I think that was a perfect point to ask you to read one of your favorite missives in this book. And
yes.
from how the book is described to me when we're talking about doing this program today, I love how your own life interplays with the life of Jamaica and the different socio-political events that took place as it unfolded. So I like how you melded the different, you gave yourself permission, is what I'm saying, Earl, to be as deliberate and as creative and as different and as Key and as Earl and as Vic Reed and as Charles Dickens as you wanted to be.
Yes. And so let me see if I can find one particular story that you can relate to, because you know some of the personalities involved. And so this is a chapter. I won't read all of the chapter, of course, but this is a chapter called Of Guns and Tears. And if you know anything about me, is that I have been very, very strong in my views about the impact of American guns on the Jamaican society.
Mm.
And I have never felt that the American government, of whichever administration, whatever stripe, has done anything close to what needs to be done, working with Jamaica to stem the flow of guns into Jamaica. And we understand some of the reasons, some of the domestic policy reasons in the United States. Nevertheless, in this chapter, I explore some of those issues, but wrapped in about 3 personal narratives. And one of them is as follows. Let me see if I can get back to it. It is now 2010, and I'm standing outside the main entrance of Kingston Public Hospital, the country's largest trauma unit situated in the heart of the capital city. A crowd of gawkers has quickly gathered around a police car that has just pulled up, siren blaring, tires squealing. The onlookers watch in silent fascination, holding their breaths for the pronouncement from the attending physician as she thrusts herself forward, her body halfway into the car, to check the blood-soaked young gunman for signs of life. Then, with the detachment of a professional who has done this far too often, she calmly declares him dead. As the crowd of onlookers melted away, their morbid fascination satisfied, my colleague and I stepped forward for a quick look ourselves. There he was, a crumpled mess, lying in a vulgar spread. Then it struck me. He could have been a carbon copy of the young man I had seen dying on the ground years earlier. The same complexion, a similar look of innocence on his face, though perhaps 10 years older, and probably the greatest similarity of all, a newly acquired hole in his head.
Mm.
At the first glimpse of his face, my colleague, a promising young sports reporter, declared dryly, "I know that boy, you know. We were in the same class at school." I turned sharply, examining his face for any show of emotion. There was none. He was always a troublemaker, so I am not surprised, he explained with a shrug. The contrast could not have been more stark. One diligently making his way in a profession he had always aspired to. The other now at the end of his life's journey, an object of hate and scorn, having just been struck down during a shootout at a bar he and another young man had held up. With the pronouncement of death, there was no longer any need for speed, so the police car slowly pulled away from the curb and made its way a few chains down from the hospital entrance to the adjoining morgue to offload yet another client, like a smoothly functioning production line. Having ascertained the element of the story unfolding, we returned to the main purpose of our visit to the hospital, inquiring about the condition of a colleague who had been shot during the holdup in the bar. An affable, well-respected senior member of our television department's technical team, Louis Burke, had just gone for his usual off-duty relaxation with old friends when the gunman struck. Shot in the side, he was now being prepared for surgery, his condition stabilized. One of his daughters, struggling to keep her emotions in check, prepared to share the terrible news via mobile phone with her sister in the United States. "Daddy has been shot," she managed, before breaking into a fresh round of tears. From my vantage point, it was not difficult to guess the effect of that pronouncement on her sister so many miles away. She had to quickly pull herself together to assure her sibling, "No, he's not dead, he's being prepared for surgery." I fervently hoped the exiled sister would now be able to hold on to that bit of assurance as she prepared to either get on the next available flight to Jamaica or keep vigil by her phone for updates on her father's condition. My reflection was suddenly broken by the most bizarre interruption as a familiar face materialized through the door. It was Tina Geddes, Louis' old colleague and drinking partner. Breathless and frantic, he inquired after Louis' condition. Then, in a tone almost of indignation, he exclaimed, "But I don't understand, Louis. We were there seated beside each other at the bar when I heard a shot. Then Louis said he had been hit. When I heard that, I turned back to my drink for one last sip. And by the time I swing back around, the man was gone." He left me on the spot without a drive. I had to get somebody else to give me a lift down here, he said by way of explanation for his late arrival. Strange as it might have sounded initially, Tino's response reflected his reality. Recently retired himself, he had spent most of his working years in sports journalism and as a crime reporter. During a 2-year stint as overnight editor preparing the morning radio news, I had come to rely on his reports from crime scenes across the capital city. No matter how dangerous, he would quickly be on location, giving the most vivid report on what had just happened. Mm-hmm. It seemed he was known by all the gang leaders and had safe passage wherever the guns barked and the bodies had fallen. Even with this, his closest of friends, now a gunshot victim beside him at a bar, therefore, Tino had retained a zen-like calm. Such was the reality of life for this grizzled reporter, whose beat had taken him on an almost daily tour of the killing fields. Mm. Those deaths fueled by the constant flow of guns from abroad.
I love it. You know.
You laugh and you want to cry at the same time.
Yes, this is it. It is very everything that you've written. And I can say to you, my viewers, everything that Earl just shared with us is true. It is so true. And what you've done by sharing that excerpt with us is taken us behind the veil, behind the curtain of what goes on in terms of the media and how, yes, we still have feelings, but you keep moving. Mm-hmm. And yes, we are impacted by world events and world catastrophes. We are. And we are there to have to deal with them and to chew them up, digest them, and regurgitate them for you. That is in a palatable way. I couldn't do that kind of media work. I can tell it's a lot. That's a lot of stress. That's a lot of work. But I think you told it beautifully. I think I'd love to see this in a documentary or in a movie, Earl.
The funny thing is, I have never, and I've said to people, I've never been a crime reporter. But you can't be a reporter in Jamaica without being touched in some way by crime. And therefore, sometimes you end up accidentally, fortuitously, whatever. You end up at a crime scene and then forget the notion of not being a crime reporter. You are that reporter.
At that time. Yes. But also, why I'm chuckling so hard, Earl, is that the rift of humor that you managed to intertwine in you just told us like about 5 stories in 3 paragraphs.
Yes.
That is absolutely brilliant. That's absolutely clever. And I think I am getting the feeling that has come from your experience as a little boy in that country town.
Yes.
Calabash Bay and Treasure Beach, where you come from, because the layers of stories that you have given us, it's just so them would talk.
Yes. But one of the persons who you mentioned who is following us at this time, Wanda Campbell, he's from my community as well. And so he knows exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the storytelling tradition from my neck of the woods, or our neck of the woods. Yes, we grew up that way.
This is a book for everybody to read, whether you're in the media or not. If you are a lover of good stories and truth, grab a copy of, please hold up your book, Vantage Point. I never knew you had such humor within you. You have to hold it up like a high up.
No, that's...
Missy him get his now.
Yes.
Missy him come out of the, Missy him boss, Missy him said that. Because I see him now. You tell.
I did prepare you for that.
You did. See the gate. I see the dance.
You see the gate, the girth.
You know what? I am looking forward to reading this book. As I say to all of my guests, You know, I don't interview your book. I talk to you, the author, because when I hear from the author why the author has penned what he or she has done, then I know that will make us fall in. Can't wait to get the book. Where can we get the book? Where can we
Yes.
get the book right now?
Unfortunately, the book is not yet available via Amazon. It's being sold in Jamaica through Kingston Bookshop mainly, but it will be available in some other outlets, and hopefully it will soon be available on Amazon as well and some other portals. I'm going to ask you to grant me the privilege of reading another short excerpt, which
Yes, yes.
helps to perhaps, in a sense, contextualize me and my family story a bit.
I'd love to hear it. And please understand, everyone, that this book was written on Earl's 30th, well, published
Yes,
on Earl's 30th anniversary. It's now 31 years. So this book
yes.
has been out for a good year or so by this.
It came out officially in December, so it's half a year.
A few months. It's a
Yes,
few months.
right.
And so on. Yes, please do go ahead. Go ahead. We'd love
I'm going to take you now to Costa Rica. I went to Costa Rica in search of the Jamaican, the Jamaica-Costa Rican connections. Not at the time I knew of my wife's relatives, her grandparents, siblings, having gone to Costa Rica in the early 20th century. What I did not know at the time was that one of my Moxam great-granduncles had also migrated to Costa Rica. And in fact, there is a link between my Moxam family and my wife's Parchment family that neither of us knew about at the time. As it turned out, the grandfather of whom I spoke just now, when his mother died, his father married a second wife, and she happened to be a Moxam. So she turned out to have been my great-grandaunt that I knew nothing about either. So just to make it clear, my wife and I are not related through that marriage because her grandfather was already born by her great-grandfather's first wife. But it also happened that she married into that Parchment family. And one of her younger brothers, he then migrated to Costa Rica with some of the Parchment children. We knew nothing about either her or her younger brother. Because though I tell you about all the stories that our parents told us, there are some things they never did share with us. Perhaps they didn't know some of it themselves. But anyway, let me pick it up when I'm back in Jamaica. April 11, 2022. We were 3 days away from the funeral service for my father-in-law, Earl Parchment, and the matters related were uppermost in our minds. It was now 2 years since my Costa Rica trip, but despite all I had learned about our familial and cultural connections there, I had come away yearning to solve one bothersome puzzle, which I had stumbled upon during my stay. Now suddenly, an unexpected encounter occasioned by the death of the Parchment family's patriarch was about to break open the puzzle. The key to the answer I sought came in the form of Dolores Reed Barker. She was the granddaughter of Stephen Parchment, one of the 5 siblings who left for Costa Rica in the 1920s. She had met one of Earl's daughters in the United States and traveled to Jamaica for the funeral. Blessed with a bubbly personality, her joy at meeting her Jamaican cousins was uncontained, and it was reciprocated. Then I was introduced to her, and at the mention of my surname, she joyfully exclaimed, "You must be related to Uncle Moxam." Now she had my undivided attention. It was at the home of Rosita McFarlane in San Jose on the eve of my departure from Costa Rica in 2020 that I first encountered someone in that country bearing my surname. There was a slight twist, however, with a variation in the spelling. George Moxam, MCSAM, Bennett, was one of the specially invited guests that evening. I was bursting with curiosity, and the questions came flooding out. His father, David, had migrated to Costa Rica when he was a teenager and lived to 100 years. David apparently did not speak much of his early years in Jamaica, and the only thing his children knew of his origins was that he was born in St. Elizabeth. It was not much to go on, but it was sufficient for me to be convinced that David was my relative. I was willing to explain away the difference in name spelling on the basis that the original formulation got lost in translation when the young man arrived in Costa Rica. As it turned out, I was not the first member of the Moxam clan to marry into the Parchment family. That distinction I had recently discovered belonged to my great-grandaunt, Jane Moxam, daughter of Stephen Robert Moxam, my great-great-grandfather. Jane, born in 1871, married Thomas Parchment Sr. in 1892, following the death of his first wife the previous year. The loss of his first wife, Charlotte, had left him with several young children, including Thomas Jr. and Emily. My marriage 9 decades later to the younger Thomas's granddaughter ultimately brought me into contact with this unfolding story. The marriage of Jane and Thomas Parchment Sr. added several more children to the family, including Stephen, presumably named after Jane's father, Stephen Moxam. The older Stephen, coincidentally, had also lost his first wife and taken a second bride, Margaret Campbell, in 1891. While Jane was having children in the 1890s, therefore, her dad was also fathering several with his second wife. One of them was David. That struck me as being most significant, recalling that George Moxam Bennett had told me of his father David's death at 100 years old in the late 1990s. It all made sense now. But how did David Moxam end up in Costa Rica? I later learned that it was at age 17 that he departed for the Central American country with his uncle Reginald, most likely his mother's brother. Being born so late in his father's life, David's older siblings were all adults, having children of their own by the time he came along. He might therefore have grown up closer to the children of his sister Jane, who were his contemporaries. As Dolores told it, he was particularly close to his nephew Stephen Parchment, so it was not surprising that he reunited with Stephen and the other Parchment siblings when they arrived in Costa Rica. 3 days after that revealing encounter with Dolores, we gathered at the church to bid farewell to Earl Parchment, the last of his generation. Dolores, so effervescent when we met, was overcome by a contrasting set of emotions as she stood at the lectern. History and fate had robbed those who went and their descendants of the warm embrace of those left behind. Now, no more, she vowed. Through tears that threatened to overwhelm, she proclaimed that she was here in their name to reclaim that which had been lost. She was speaking, it seemed, for all those who, when we met in Costa Rica, shared how much they yearned for that moment of healing. That day would come, they inferred, when they were able to walk the streets and byways of Jamaica, embraced their newly discovered kin, and affirmed that, of a truth, they were part of a special heritage, one now made manifest in the flesh. So that's the story of the Parchments and the Moxams in Costa Rica.
Listen, that is, and I'm sure this story of the lineage is not finished yet being told.
No, arising from that encounter, I got together with the descendants of David. They're all over, many of them are still in Costa Rica, but some of them are also in the United States. And we have discovered many other descendants from this common ancestor, Stephen Robert Moxam, and his brother. And we are organizing a gathering of the Moxam clan in Treasure Beach on Emancipation Day.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
That is simply amazing. Wow.
So I was able to use the vehicle of my journalism because I went to Costa Rica, first of all, for a genuine story. I went to cover a meeting convened by the European Union and its Latin American and Caribbean counterparts.
Mhm.
So having covered that, I then went off to explore this aspect of the Jamaica-Costa Rican history, the connection. And I also walked in the footsteps of Marcus Garvey in Port Limon, went to his, what remained of his Liberty Hall and his collection there, because the bigger structure had been burned down a few years earlier. But I was able to get a good grasp of the importance then and continuing impact and relevance of Marcus Garvey. I was also able to walk along the train lines that were constructed in the 1870s by Jamaican workers, the train line rolling from Port Limon to San Jose to transport the bananas from the coast up to the capital. And they said that for every post that they laid there, a Jamaican died in the effort to build that railway, because it went through very treacherous territory. And so that particular experience is one that has stayed with me, because it opened up for me an important piece of our history that many Jamaicans are not aware of. First of all, the number of Jamaicans who actually migrated to Costa Rica. I grew up, and perhaps you did too, learning about our Jamaicans who went to Panama to work on the canal. But what we did not actually learn in primary school is how many of them also went to Costa Rica and elsewhere in Central America. But ultimately, more ended up in Costa Rica, it seemed, than actually went to Panama. And some of those who went to Panama, at the expiration of the construction project, many of them moved across to Costa Rica, because by then the Costa Rican the banana industry had taken off under the influence of United Fruit Company, which was a mixed blessing. So many of them moved across from Panama to Costa Rica, in addition to those who went directly to work either on the railway line or on the banana plantations. So round about 1915 or thereabouts, there were already 50,000 Jamaicans, it was estimated, in Costa Rica.
You know what? No wonder your book is called Vantage Point Jamaica, a reporter's chronicle. It's all of that and more. Because it's not a straight news story, guys. It's not a straight news story. It's a story, it's history, it's your own personal discovery of all the connections that we have. Because Jamaica may seem small, but we're really not that small after all. And I noticed that over the past 3 weeks, in speaking with our authors, heritage has played a very huge role in them coming to terms of what they are currently doing and why they wrote the books that they did. And this is one such example. This is yet another example. And my heart is so very happy that we have you, Earl, writing this book. How long did it take you to put all these pieces together?
I actually started writing, I had hoped to publish it for my 25th year in journalism. And therefore, I think I started about 2 years before the 25th anniversary. And soon enough realized that because I am so hard on myself and wanted to get everything right, that I was not going to make the 25th anniversary. And therefore, it took me all of another 5 years. But this time I was determined to make it for the 30th. And happily I did.
You so did. So did. In working with your editors, how difficult or easy was it for you to do that? In working with your editors, doing rewrites, and finally getting to press? How was that process for you?
Happily, my editor on this project is somebody you know, Moya Thomas. And because Moya is my friend, now that can be a two-edged sword, because, if the person is your friend, sometimes friendship can get in the way of doing the business, but that was not a factor here. The reason why I say it was good that I had my friend working with me on it, there was greater understanding of the process along the way, and we were able to communicate regularly, sometimes at odd hours, and we were able to have very good and fruitful, exchanges about what to change and what not to change. And we could have our debates. And some of these debates, perhaps I might prevail a little. Sometimes she would prevail. But ultimately, it worked to the extent that I think we finished the process with a book that is much better for the fact that we had that collaboration.
I'm loving that. I'm loving that so much. I'm very proud of you. I want to again pause and just acknowledge the folks who took the time out to sit down and be a part of our conversation. People like Bruce Wallace, Leroy Yagaro. Bruce says Earl Moxam, the walking encyclopedia. Penny Lawrence says this is such an interesting lesson. Bruce is telling Cozy Abrams to log on now.
Oh.
Andreen Bonner says, boy, she loves Dickens as well. Another fine writer. Dave Rodney insists that, listen, the work is gripping. The work is gripping. Canute says, Earl, how do crime reporters separate themselves from the grim and the gruesome images they see on a daily basis while trying to remain unbothered? I'll let you answer that.
Well, I suppose I've had the blessing of not being a regular crime reporter, but then I cannot divorce myself from, I'm in the newsroom, I hear it happening on a daily basis. I start that particular chapter actually literally standing over a young man with the life draining out of him in Ligani, he having shot an elderly shopkeeper and then having been shot by the police in turn. And that has stayed with me ever since. And one of the things that struck me about that particular experience was the fact that there was so little, there was hardly any empathy coming from those who stood around him, looking at him. In fact, many of them were issuing, I suppose he departed with their words of anger and scorn in his ears. And in a sense, you can understand why that was so, because they were thinking of the elderly man, the innocent shopkeeper who he had just shot. So that is what that level of criminality can do to a society, because it robs us of that human element of empathy, because you get to a point where you feel that if there's no other recourse, just get rid of all of them.
Yeah.
What does that make of the rest of us?
Yes.
So in terms of the reporters who have that beat on a regular basis, I think it can be soul destroying, but you have to find a way, which is to a certain extent perhaps why some journalists who have had that beat over the years tend to, some of them, for example, they drink quite a bit. Maybe that helps to, it's part of the coping mechanism. I don't have a perfect answer, but it's certainly, like I say, you don't even have to be a regular beat reporter covering the crime scene. The fact is you are touched by it almost every day.
I read news along with Errol Lee for quite a bit of time while I was at Power 106.
Yes.
It was not one of my most pleasant experiences. Yes, we could maintain the professional bravado and deliver, but it doesn't feel good on the inside.
It's interesting you should mention that. I recall, and you spoke earlier of Doreen, our colleague who sadly left us a few years ago. Doreen, very professional, would be reading the news, especially when she made the transition to television. And she would, you would see her reading the stories with a straight face and professional tones. And then when we went to the break and the cameras were off, then you see the face fell and you see like she was drained
Yes, it's
at
rough.
having to read some of those horrendous stories.
It's rough. The ones that used to get me is when we were reading about the things that happened to little girls.
The little girls, yes.
That was not. I'm glad I didn't do it for much longer. But Dave Rodney says he's trying to reach Lester Hines. He just loved this. He would love to enjoy this.
Yes. I think I got to RJR just after Lester left, but I've encountered him, and you can't pass through Radio Jamaica and the newsroom and not be touched by the stories of some of your predecessors.
Listen, no. What a lovely read, Suzanne Jones says. Thanks for my signed copy, Sir Moxam.
Hi, Suzanne.
John Andrea says, my respect for Moxam is way tall.
Oh,
Yeah.
Joan, thank you.
Suzanne, yes, thank you so much for watching. I'm so glad. Yes, I'm so happy that do you know how long me and Earl been talking to get to here?
Nothing before the right time.
Nothing before the right time. And this is it, when you're in this business, you know that for a fact. I remember I invited someone on and they say, oh, you media people are always in such a hurry. I said, you know what? We do both. We do immediate and we do long-term planning, and we do everything in between. We're that flexible.
Yes.
So if we want to, show up 3 months from now, hey, we are ready, so, and that is it. When you're in this business, we understand that now is the time. We understand that. And we also understand too that things need a little time to bubble and grow, just like your book Vantage Point. Arlene Bonner writes, she says the Association of Caribbean Women Writers and Scholars will hold their 2023 conference in June. So she says it would be nice to continue those stories. So do tell us more, do connect with Earl and connect with me, and let's know about that. Thank you so much, Canute. Canute is enjoying our interview, Earl, so much. Saffron Mayer is watching, Conroy Reed is watching, Stephen Woodham is watching. Conroy Reed says, Earl, this must represent your crowning glory as one of Jamaica's foremost journalists. Well done. Congratulations. And Andreen is actually saying, I thought that's what you meant, that the conference will be held in Costa Rica. Yes.
Interesting.
So sangsters, Moxons, and mayors all will be reuniting in Western Jamaica soon. Earl, we need to talk more about everything. I'm gonna have to do a part 2 coming out, and especially around the time when it hits Amazon. But in the meantime, I know if Jamaicans are very, very keen on getting this book, I know they know somebody who knows somebody who's somebody coming from Jamaica too, wherever they are in the world, because Jamaicans are so all over the world.
Indeed.
They would definitely grab hold of a copy of Vantage Point Jamaica. From the journalist point of view, the journalist we have as our guest, Earl Moxam. As I mentioned, Jamaicans all over the world, you have traveled widely in your role as a journalist. So further, that must inform what you came to the table writing. What were some of the most intriguing travels outside of going to Costa Rica last year that you have met with in your role as a journalist that also helped inform what you put in your Vantage Point?
I write up one of them in a chapter called The Battle of Seattle. And in fact, that was the tag given to the anti-globalization protests at the time of the WTO conference in Seattle, Washington, in late November 1999. I went there to cover it. I knew that there would be protests, but perhaps underestimated the extent of the protests. And so when I left my hotel that morning, I was totally unprepared, both in terms of my clothing and in terms of my reporting expectation, because the walk from my hotel to the conference center was, under normal circumstances, a pretty short walk. But it ended up that I did not make it to the conference center for the entire day, nor could I get back to the hotel. And my clothing was fairly light because I thought a brisk walk would suffice. And so I then ended up having to be marching along with the protesters and eventually just to keep warm in the first instance. And then decided, well, at least I have my tape recorder. So I started recording and interviewing people. And my colleagues back in the newsroom, remember, these were the early days of the internet, and there was no social media availability. So I couldn't have been live tweeting or anything. I did not have even a cell phone with me then. And so they saw something on CNN to the effect that there were these protests, but they did not fully grasp the extent of, the action that was taking place there on the streets. And so I wasn't able to connect with them that day, but I certainly had quite a story to report when I was able to connect with them. And how I ended up, I don't remember how I got there, but somehow late in the night, I ended up in a hotel suite along with the entire Caribbean delegation. All the prime ministers and foreign affairs ministers and whoever was there, all of us ended up in this hotel suite. I think that hotel suite was for the foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Barbados, Billy Miller at the time. I think it was. But in that particular moment, there was no difference between journalist and government official or Jamaican and Trini and Bajan and nothing. In that moment of challenge, we were all one people facing the same threats of whatever nature in that hotel room. And it was one of those very, very important moments for me, symbolically and otherwise. We are not as large and independent of each other as we may think we are. Another hair-raising experience, well, this one was far more hair-raising in the end, just in terms of the imminent danger that I found myself in. I was in Colombia, and I was part of a group looking at Plan Colombia, which is the American response to the drugs trafficking issue in Colombia and the other problems they're having there. And we were going, I was about to get into a helicopter for a flight over the Andes. And as I was about to enter the helicopter, one of the Colombian soldiers said to me, "Oh, by the way, there's a slight chance that we could be shot at while we're up here, up in the air." Now, what do I do at that moment? Do I step back? Do I step back, or do I go forward? And I just had to swallow hard and proceed. And because I grew up watching Western movies and reading Louis L'Amour and others, and you read of the glint of the rifle to alert you that somebody might be aiming at you. I am there up in the helicopter looking down for some sign like that of something about to happen, but thankfully it didn't happen.
It sounds to me like you're gonna have to end up doing a vantage point too. That's what it sounds like.
There are lots of stories to be told, but then I have other stories of a different nature to tell as well. So we'll see.
Yeah, look, we look forward to that. And as I said to you as we were talking about getting together on Why I Write, I find that for us as journalists, media people, we don't big up ourselves and we're so busy telling other people's stories. So it is a huge congratulations to you that you still push through from your 25th anniversary to your 30th anniversary and now your 31st. And now we have this book, Vantage Point. So playfully, skillfully written and penned and put together. And we look forward to reading it and seeing more work coming from you. And yes, you're right. As journalists, as media people, we do need to let our voices be heard in whatever form, shape, or fashion that we can, because it's valuable. It's so valuable and it's so valid. And we need to tell our stories. We need to control our narrative. so that once we leave this world, we leave behind the document so that others may follow. So again, heartiest congratulations. As we wrap tonight, I just want to make sure that we're not leaving out anybody who may want to say anything. Dave Rodney said big congratulations. Conroy, you're gonna have to reach out to the book, the Kingston, it was Kingston Publishers, you said?
Kingston Bookshop.
Kingston Bookshop. They can hook you up, Conroy, and you will find out those details. Thank you so much, David, for watching. Dave Rodney for watching. Thanks everyone for watching. Any parting words? You know, Earl, before I leave, I really have to say to you that, boy, I want to start asking a whole lot of other questions like, you know, what do you think we can do about education in Jamaica? You mentioned about guns. What can we do about the economic situation? But you know what? We're going to leave that for another time. In parting tonight, what are the few words you'd like to leave with us, Earl?
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for facilitating this discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's been good linking up with you again. Yeah. And I really want to thank everybody who has joined us and for this discussion, and thank you all for the generous comments that you have made. I take nothing for granted, and I came into journalism with no particular expectation at the time as to how successful I might have been, and to the extent that I have been adjudged to have made some kind of success as what I'm doing. I'm very grateful, and I will never ever take anything for granted. And I hope that this book will have a positive impact on everybody who reads it. I think there's a little bit of something in it for everybody.
Like a true journalist, a true son of the Jamaican soil. And they said best soil to where them have the bestest melon.
Indeed, absolutely.
The best watermelon comes from St. Elizabeth, and also the best scallion.
Yes.
Just in case people don't know. See, I know things. Earl, it has been my pleasure as well sharing with you. It was always a pleasure seeing you come in with your quiet manner, and you weren't more serious than anybody else, but we know that you were serious about work, and that was all we needed, because when we open our mouth to report whatever stories you gave us, we know that it was solid stuff. We didn't have to wonder. We didn't have to wonder. We knew.
I know you have discovered that behind the seriousness, there was also a sense of humor.
Listen now, you have to be humorous, you know. Survive all of these things. You have to take, as they've said in Jamaica, take bad things, make laugh sometimes.
Indeed.
Me like how Tina get his star another one.
I thought you would.
So take care of yourself, Earl. Walk good, all the best. And I look forward to hearing more from you about other projects that you are working on. Let me know, keep us in the loop. When your book, as soon as your book hits Amazon, you give me a know so that we can share the information far and wide. Looking forward to hearing and seeing even more of you in the years to come. Congrats. Thank you so much again for being here as our guest on Why I Write.
Thanks again, Kathleen. All the best.